Sci-fi horror is my favorite genre of fiction. Not only has it produced some of the best works of genre fiction in the past 100 years, like The Thing, Alien, and Dead Space, but it appeals to me because the genre is capable of exploring areas that are simply inaccessible to other arenas, and can also, for example, exaggerate cosmic horror to its limit by presenting a powerful and advanced human civilization that is still impotent in the face of dark universal forces. And of course, many of these works facilitate extremely provocative thematic and philosophical discussion. Why am I talking about this? Well, because I love this genre, I'm always on the hunt for new, interesting pieces of media to consume. And my favorites of the genre are works like Dead Space, where characters are placed into an isolated environment with something extremely dangerous, and as the curtain is slowly pulled back, something mysterious and cosmic takes shape. Well, when I heard of Nick Cutter's The Deep, described as The Abyss meets The Shining, where in order to defeat a mysterious amnesia plague called the Gets, a research team retreats to the Mariana Trench to experiment with a substance known as ambrosia, which seems to have miraculous healing properties, and there they encounter something unspeakably evil, I was extremely excited. It sounded absolutely perfect according to my tastes. But now let's flash back to my video on extreme horror books, where I kind of randomly launched a stray insult at The Deep, calling it terrible. So, those are my rankings. None of the books here were bad. I've definitely read worse. Like The Deep by Nick Cutter. Just terrible. Pretty crazy that I went from completely excited to full of rage and willing to launch a stray in an unrelated video, right? And of course, many of y'all noticed that, since Nick Cutter has written many famous books, like The Troop and Little Heaven. Some agreed with me, and others just wondered why I would say such a thing. And yeah, it was a little crazy of me. So here I am, to finally get this off my chest, to unload my grief with this book, but also to do a bit of therapy. When I first read The Deep, it was probably one of the most frustrating literary experiences I have ever had. I was downright cruel in my original personal review of the book, launching ad hominem after ad hominem at Nick Cutter. So as I prepared for this video, I was ready for it to be an unbridled hate fest. And while I have many gripes with this book, I'm happy to say that on a reread, I was able to find more redeeming factors. This critique is a lot more, I won't say positive, but non-negative than I was expecting it to be. And I'm happy with that. Critique without positive redirection doesn't feel right to me. So it should be said that if you like this book, while I will be highly negative in some cases, this is obviously just my experience with the book. I've seen other reviews that highlight why people enjoy The Deep, and their experiences are valid and so are yours. I'm just here to outline my own critiques. Also, if you like videos on dark fiction and philosophy, I would highly encourage subscribing to my channel. I always try to make my videos measured, thought-provoking, and interesting, but every now and then, I need to blow off, a little bit of steam. Here are some content warnings, listed on screen. None of these will be discussed sensationally, but they will all be mentioned to varying degrees. I'm gonna discuss the plot of the book in pretty broad strokes, and outline my opinions as we go along, and I will spoil the ending. However, I have taken care to not spoil every single aspect of the book. This video is not a replacement for reading The Deep at all. If you're curious about the book, you should go read it for yourself. As you'll see by the end, though, I can say that if the premise of The Gets, the amnesia plague, sounds particularly interesting to you, don't let that be the reason you read it. Also, as you'll see, the discussion here will sometimes seem a bit disjointed and jumbled and feverish. That's deliberate. Normally, I structure my videos pretty heavily, but I tried to channel The Deep's structural style into this video. You'll see what I mean. As a preview though, my argument is basically that while having a fantastic premise, great atmosphere and themes, with a few standout sections of incredible horror, both physical and conceptual, overall, The Deep is frustrating because of its disruptive and slow pacing, flat, misguided characterization, dismissive attitude towards its own premise, some genuinely goofy moments, and a host of hollow scares. Anyways, on to the plot and the critique. The book opens following main character Luke, a veterinarian. He's in Guam and is observing a strange scene. An old man, covered in pus-seeping scabs and spots. His eyes are milky white and his mouth hangs open. His face is blank. He walks forward, bumping into a wall repeatedly. Mantises prance around on the old man's head. There's a body before Luke, but absolutely no mind. The man is infected with the Gets. It's an amnesia plague that has caused a slow, quiet apocalypse. Once you catch it, you forget the little things, then bigger things, then critical, very important things. Then your body forgets to breathe, your heart forgets to beat, and you die. It's also stated that it isn't, quote, spread through physical contact, nor through the transmission of bodily fluids, or as an airborne pathogen. Weird. And outside of humans, and weirdly bees, no other animals are capable of contracting the disease. So the Gets is pretty mysterious and quite powerful, as it's causing the slow downfall of humanity. But there is hope, and that's why Luke is in Guam. You see, humanity encountered a substance known as ambrosia that seems to basically cure every ailment, even granting longevity. The natural assumption for a desperate species on the brink of collapse from an amnesia plague, then, is that maybe, just maybe, this miracle cure will be able to take on the Gets. And the only concentration of ambrosia that's ever been located is in the Mariana Trench, in Challenger Deep, the deepest part of the ocean. So humanity sets up a lab down there, the Trieste, and they send 3 of their top scientists down: Dr. Cooper Westlake, Dr. Hugo Toy, and Dr. Clayton Nelson, who is Luke's genius brother, all in the hopes that they can figure out the properties of the ambrosia and establish a cure for the Gets. But contact between the surface and the Trieste has been lost, save for one strange message from Clayton, calling for Luke to come down, or rather to come home. So Luke has been called to go down to the Trieste and figure out what the heck is happening. This is the setup of the novel, and right off the bat, I'm gonna say that I love it. I don't love it uncontroversially, of course, especially knowing where it all goes, and I have some gripes with the writing, but I like the general idea here. Humanity is on the brink of collapse from an explicitly mysterious amnesia disease, and their only hope in stopping it comes from a last-ditch attempt at harnessing the power of an equally mysterious curative substance known as ambrosia, which resides at the bottom of the ocean. But something seems to have gone seriously wrong down there. When I was reading this, I was locked in. So, Luke travels to the surface station and learns he will be escorted down to the Trieste by Alice Sykes, a lieutenant commander in the US Navy. It's here that we learn that Dr. Westlake has surfaced recently, and we are shown the state of his body. It's described as being entirely scar tissue. His body is a, quote, ballooned, inflated parody of the human form. Additionally, as Dr. Westlake ascended to the surface, he apparently suffered from a condition known as the bends, or more formally, decompression sickness, which is where rapid pressure changes cause nitrogen bubbles to form in the bloodstream, which normally just cause joint pain, but in its worst forms can cause paralysis and even death. In Dr. Westlake's case, it seems to have wreaked massive havoc on his body's entire structure, literally bending and reshaping his limbs into strange angles. It's a horrifying sight, and really makes your imagination go wild. Like, how did he manage to become covered in such scar tissue? Also, his body is accompanied by a mysterious message written in blood. The Agme are here. Spoiler alert, but the scenes with Dr. Westlake are some of the only things I truly like in the book. Also, I'm gonna speed up the plot summary because, I'm not gonna lie, a whole lot of nothing occurs for the next 40% of the book. Basically, Alice and Luke go down to the Trieste. Dr. Toy shows his face behind a door window, says, "You are not what you are," then shambles off. It's super weird. They find a dog. Uh-oh. Luke calls it LB. Then, as Alice walks away to check on a door lock, a horrifying scene occurs. The lights go out, and in the darkness, Luke hears a slithering noise. Almost like 1,000 tiny limbs moving in unison. It sounds like... Now, wouldn't it be a shame if I stopped this review right at this tense moment to talk about something completely orthogonal that you're really not interested in? It would disrupt the pacing and tension of my argument that, as of yet, is only in nascent form. Well, now you know exactly how reading The Deep feels. You see, I've been presenting The Deep fairly linearly so far, but that's actually doing the book an injustice. Or really, a justice. In truth, the book stops every couple of chapters to have a flashback to Luke's past. There, we learn copious details about Clayton's previous scientific experiments, their mother's abuse, a few run-ins with some monsters on the surface world, and eventually we get an account of Luke's son Zach going missing. Keep that in mind, it's relatively important. I have many problems with these flashbacks, but there's obviously a reason for their inclusion, right? Nominally, the book has this theme of memory. I mean, remember the Gets? The amnesia plague that's been eradicating humanity? The Gets is the entire driving force of the plot, and it causes people to forget. So it makes a lot of sense that, as a thematic inversion, Luke would end up doing a lot of remembering. But my issue at this juncture is that these frequent and frequently very lengthy flashbacks destroy the book's pacing and tension, and don't meaningfully contribute to the book otherwise. Though I'll explore that second aspect later. It doesn't matter if a moment in the main timeline is fast or slow, tense or dry, they are all candidates for a flashback interruption. The flow will be stopped, dead stopped, to show us something tangential and usually not very interesting. Just imagine if in Dead Space you're going through the game, having a good time, but every couple rooms you have to play through a 10-minute sequence of Isaac having dinner as a child with his drunk dad. Now, aside from the problems with this that I will talk about later, this would be terrible because it would obviously interrupt the flow of the game. Sounds completely awful, right? Case in point, the scene where Luke hears something big slithering and skittering in the darkness. Remember that? From a while ago? Right before I interrupted for this tangent? So as I'm rereading the book, I'm awaiting this moment because I remember being pretty annoyed at it the first time. And when it cuts away to a flashback, right as this scene is building some decent tension, and the first words I read in the flashback scene are, quote, "Years ago, when his life was much better, Luke had been invited to a veterinary conference in Arizona." Oh my god, was I annoyed. A work conference? Really? You're choosing to take me away from Luke being attacked by a giant millipede in Challenger Deep in the apocalypse to show us some scene from Luke's past when he was at a work conference. Okay, well, it better be good. And what does the flashback show? It shows his son Zach being bitten by a millipede in his pajamas. And Luke goes like absolutely ballistic on this millipede. It's pretty funny how completely he flies off the rails in his rabid destruction of this mindless bug. I'll touch on this more later, but this scene exists to justify Luke getting attacked by a millipede in the present, and so it has to be super traumatic for Luke. And Nick Cutter's way of emphasizing that was basically to make Luke fly into a berserker rage at this bug, calling it monstrous and evil and whatnot, and it's extremely silly. So that's what it shows us, a pretty random incident of Zach getting bitten by a millipede. And then we cut back to the present, where the giant millipede actually appears, and it kind of leisurely walks toward him, for like a page and a half. Luke obviously runs away, because, giant millipede that's connected to some past trauma, and sees his brother Clayton, and when he turns back to look at the millipede, it's revealed that the whole thing was a hallucination. The millipede is completely gone. So Clay takes Luke and Alice to view the seafloor and look at the floating sheets of ambrosia. Clay confirms that he didn't send the message inviting Luke, and hints that there seems to be an intelligence directing the ambrosia, because it appears to be allowing itself to be caught for the scientific experimentation. This is a pretty cool hint, and there have been other hints like this before. One of the doctors on the surface, Dr. Fells, speculated that the ambrosia was connected to a greater mother organism, which is a terrifying prospect. And after this, we return to the coolest aspect of the book. I mentioned earlier that the parts featuring Dr. Westlake were my favorite in the book. Well, we get the first of these soon after, but I'm going to cover all of them here because I might as well. Much of the remaining plot is not worth remarking upon, so I'll be skipping around as I see fit until the ending. Luke listens to audio recordings and reads journals left behind by Dr. Westlake, and these serve as important lore. Dr. Westlake discovers what he calls a hole in his lab. It's basically a growing, shimmery circle that acts as a portal between the interior of the Trieste and the deep outside. He makes contact with something on the outside, and these scenes are pretty eerie. It's more confirmation that something intelligent is directing the events at hand, and we get more mentions of the bees, as they seem very interested in the hole. Speaking of the bees, eventually Dr. Westlake gives the ambrosia to the honeybee population that they fostered in the Trieste, which has since come to near extinction due to the Gets. Well, the introduction of the ambrosia makes the population completely rebound, but Dr. Westlake gets stung by the bees, which introduces the ambrosia into his system. And something you need to know about the ambrosia is that, terrifyingly, it will not let its host organism die if it doesn't want it to. It's like a parasitic medicine. Here, I'm going to go off on yet another tangent to briefly talk about a big theme of the novel that I enjoy, and it's important because it's epitomized in Dr. Westlake's chapters. I've mentioned that there is an intelligence directing the ambrosia, and we'll find out later that this intelligence has been consciously directing nearly every event in the entire book. The monsters that appeared in Luke's childhood, Zach's disappearance, monsters that appear in Dr. Westlake's flashbacks, which, side note, the fact that there are flashbacks even in the journals is so annoying, but also Clayton's message for Luke, among many other things. These are all results of this intelligence's direction. The world is like their laboratory, and they've been arranging the conditions for the experiment that constitutes the book's plot. And this motif of bigger creatures experimenting on and exploiting and objectifying smaller and less powerful creatures has been a recurring image even from the beginning pages, when Luke sees those aforementioned mantises and debates smashing them, basically just because they're there and because he can do it. It continues with Clayton's experiments on the mice that are explored in the flashback sections, and the current day experiments described in the Trieste. And importantly, not just Dr. Westlake gets a hole in his lab for communication with the intelligence. All 3 doctors get a hole. The Trieste is like the cage for 3 Dr. Rats, and the hole is the interface for the intelligence outside to experiment upon them. This is kind of the main thematic point of the novel in my read. Humans act like we are superior to other creatures, and we are so happy to exploit them for our own curiosity and other purposes, because we can, and it would be terrifying if other bigger entities would do it to us. So back to Dr. Westlake. He's infected with the ambrosia through the bee sting, and eventually becomes a sort of human-bee hybrid, all while under the influence of the nearby hole to the sea floor. He births bees. They incubate inside of him, squirm underneath his skin, and emerge from all over his body, and they recognize him as their leader, and vice versa. But he slowly goes mad. He realizes that he's being manipulated by something much greater than himself, that this intelligence has been behind the events in his past, knows him inside and out, wanted him down here, wanted this exact fate for him, and will not let him do otherwise. And when he tries to end his own life, the ambrosia won't let him die. It instantly heals him. He's scared of his own thoughts, because he can't tell whether they're his or not. All he knows is that he's having them. Not only are these Westlake portions insanely creepy to read in and of themselves, because of the mere idea of communicating with something intelligent at the bottom of the ocean, but these scenes are scary to me because they embody the theme of the deep in its utmost form and do it to great effect. It's great body horror, sure, that's cool, but it's also just the fact that Dr. Westlake starts off so confidently believing that he's in control of the situation. After all, he's the scientist, he's the experimenter, the exploiter. But eventually, he discovers that he's just a mere lab rat and has never been anything but that, and his body is changing against his will. Remember Dr. Toy saying, "You are not who you are." He's even been deprived of the most primal act of ownership one has over oneself, that of taking one's own life. And to not even trust your own thoughts. Dr. Westlake might as well be a Cartesian brain in a vat. This is the kind of skeptical horror that this section evoked in me. And at the end of Westlake's journal, Westlake writes, "The figmen are here," referencing something Zach used to say, a mispronunciation of figment, as in a figment of his imagination, which makes Luke realize that the phrase "the Agme are here" that Westlake had written in blood near his body was actually "figmen are here." But the blood had run and distorted the words. It's even more evidence of the large-scale manipulation that's been taking place. I truly love these parts. This is the kind of book I wanted. Nick Cutter obviously wanted psychological horror, and this is how you do it. Like, not to glaze it too much, it's still interrupted by pointless flashbacks, but it is genuinely effective horror writing, and that's why I want to highlight it for praise. I may be very critical in this review, but Nick Cutter is obviously capable of quality stuff, and scenes like this just make it that much sadder that the rest of the book fell short for me. Speaking of falling short for me, let's circle back to the millipede hallucination for a bit, and a few of the other ones. There's one where Luke sees a hallucination of a headless Zack, and another where Luke sees the dreaded tickle trunk, and then he sees a giant crawling hand, and there are plenty of others. For reference, the tickle trunk, yes, that's its name, is a storage trunk covered in clowns that Luke's abusive mom bought him as a child, and the evil intelligence used it to traumatize him back then. Unfortunately, in the book, it reads as just laughable and stupid, but you're supposed to take it seriously. Anyways, for the majority of the book, outside of the Westlake sections and flashbacks, the only scares are these hallucination sections, and you learn early on that they're not real. Now, I don't know about you, but I have a very hard time feeling any level of tension for hallucination scares, and consequently, I just didn't care. And it's especially sad because the Westlake chapters showed how absolutely fantastic the horror could have been. Now, for those who haven't read the book, and even some who have, you might be thinking, Branamander, aren't the hallucination chapters ultimately channeling the same kind of fear that Westlake's sections are? that you're slowly losing control of your own mind to some greater intelligence, and these hallucinations are effects of that mental unraveling. And you would be correct, but the context is very, very important here. For one, outside of the Zach hallucination, each of the other hallucinations has an associated flashback which introduces it immediately before. Meaning, these aren't usually some deep-seated fears or traumas that always haunt Luke, that thoroughly inform the essence of his character, that are then weaponized by the evil intelligence. It comes across as basically Nick Cutter wanting to have a giant millipede in the book, and then hastily writing a flashback with a big millipede to justify the inclusion. The context for the scares is rarely properly motivated. It's almost always a hasty introduction right before or during the scene, which also interrupts the tension that Nick Cutter had built up. And if we think of something like the Dead Space series, we can look at protagonist Isaac. Isaac is constantly hallucinating, but those hallucinations are almost always motivated beforehand, trauma-centered, and usually, but not always, focused on deception, coercion, manipulation, and fear. And generally, if there's physical danger, it comes from an illusion designed to make Isaac self-harm. In the Deep, the fear is basically just, what if a giant millipede ran at Luke? And why is it scary? Oh, well, let me invent a reason in Luke's past real quick. Okay, there we go. Now that I've given it a backstory, it has to be terrifying to you, right? But it's not. These scenes don't infect the reader's mind at all with any genuine sense of paranoia or dread, at least in my case. Hallucinations are scary if they're consequential in some way, as I found them to be in Dead Space. But here, they weren't. They were isolated scenes that Luke would basically just brush off. In fact, they made me even more frustrated because these goofy hallucination scares were really the sole justification for the existence of the flashbacks. So the fact that they didn't work, while Dr. Westlake's chapters really did, and that the flashbacks already ruined the pacing for me, just made me really sad. Now again, some of you may be saying, hold on a second, Branamander, these flashbacks are obviously written to deepen the characters and give them a textured, rich history. And again, I think you're right that this was Nick Cutter's intent, but I think his overall effect was off the mark. Let me explain. The Deep devotes a lot of time to developing each character's history, but doesn't do enough work, in my opinion, to make the characters interesting enough outside of that. To put it bluntly, giving a character a history while leaving them otherwise undeveloped doesn't make them interesting. This is pretty subjective, but to me, Luke and Alice especially came across as extremely bland, underwritten characters in the current timeline. Their dialogue lacked any kind of specificity or spark. Their lines could have been mouthed by anyone, and Luke's thoughts, as revealed by the narration, seem very generic. Rather than real people that come alive off the page, they feel like rough outlines, or that picture of the gray NPC. It's like these flashback scenes are telling me why I should care for Luke, rather than compelling me to care with actually good writing. Make him dynamic and interesting, because if he's flat, it doesn't matter what history he's gone through, he's still going to be boring to read, and I won't like it. I'll give a bit of credit to the scientists, Clayton, Hugo, and Cooper, because even though they're written like Big Bang Theory cliches, Clayton especially, they at least feel well defined, which is something Alice and Luke sorely lacked. So yeah, giving bland characters flashbacks does nothing for their development. Those familiar with my channel know I really enjoyed the book Gone to See the Riverman. That book has consistent flashbacks, about as frequent as The Deep. Maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is that the flashbacks in Gone to See the Riverman serve an auxiliary role of development, while in The Deep, the flashbacks basically exist as the main source of character development for Luke. Laurie and Abby in Riverman are already very well defined in the present day, so the flashbacks serve to give us ever-increasing context. But the key to these flashbacks, and what is Gone to See the Riverman's greatest trick, is that the flashbacks in that novel end up completely recontextualizing the presently well-defined dynamic. We have Laurie and Abby, we see these two well-defined sisters interacting, we think we know them, and then, through these flashbacks, we come to know the horrifying truth of their past. It works because Gone to See the Riverman has a present dynamic that can be recontextualized, but the Deep's characters are flat, so the flashbacks don't have much of an impact. This is ultimately why I think The Deep fails to interest me for 70% of its length. I like the setup, but the pacing is weak, the characterization completely misses the mark, and the emphasis on the horror is generally off. Had it focused more on characterizing Luke in the present, de-emphasized the baseless hallucination scares, focused on a better integration of the flashbacks, leaned into the kind of horror that Westlake's chapters emphasized, and maybe made the actual movement of the plot interesting, I would have been more engaged. I haven't mentioned the plot of this section much otherwise, but yeah, basically it's a lot of walking around the Trieste, seeing scary things, flashing back, etc. Alice and Luke try to go back to the surface, but they can't because the Challenger, the little vehicle they use to take to the elevator, is without power. So they have to work on charging it. In the meantime, Luke finds Dr. Toy. He's gone a little whack, but he's nice to Luke and talks to him. That is, until the Trieste literally collapses on top of him and absolutely destroys his body. You see, The Deep is 395 pages long, and by about page 285, if you really try to take stock of the book's events, especially if you haven't been having a great time like me, you'd realize that not much has happened yet, especially when considering that most of the scares have been harmless hallucinations. By this I mean that yeah, stuff has technically happened on page, but the characters have barely been developed. Their relationships have yet to meaningfully evolve, and the horror has been mostly without real stakes. There's been movement, but it's mostly been in circles rather than forward. It appears that Nick Cutter realized this, and tried to shove a ton of crazy events with a ton of gross out torture body horror in the last 100 pages or so leading up to the final reveals. Every remaining character is dispatched in quite gruesome fashion, unfortunately including the dog that I mentioned before, but if I'm being honest, I actually enjoyed this chunk quite a bit. I think part of me was so unbelievably anxious for something to happen that even if the gross out abuse and torture feels a little bit cheap or like it was intended to shock, I was willing to accept it because it was different than the otherwise plodding pacing of the rest of the book. Of course, it may appear at this point that I'm a thrill junkie who can't stand a slow burn, but I think it's quite obvious that this isn't true. My favorite works of art tend to be atmospheric, meditative, and character-driven rather than plot or action or even scare-driven. Sure, the preceding pages of The Deep could be characterized as a slow burn, but they didn't constitute an effective one. Part of the term slow burn, after all, is the word burn, but most of the time, there was barely even a spark. Anyways, yeah, we get a rush of horror, both real and imagined, and shockingly, I found that I didn't even mind the hallucinated imagined stuff, even when it was still under the pretense of it being physically dangerous. I think this is because these hallucinations were a little bit more character relevant and trauma motivated, like the better kind of hallucinatory horror I described above. The context was actually established for them to not feel like baseless, random, spooky things. As I briefly alluded to above, these penultimate scenes include the graphic torture and death of the dog. 2 of them, in fact. Some people really don't like this. And look, I totally get that. It's not fun for me to read either. I love dogs just as much as anybody else, and the cynical part of me really does want to say it was just a cheap ploy to draw us into the book's horror, since I'm a certified The Deep skeptic, but I actually didn't mind this event. To me, the dog's deaths were perfectly consistent with the theme of exploitation I discussed above. And there were some pretty scary images leading up to it. Dogs are such a safe subject to me, so distorting their form and face is particularly effective. It actually did get under my skin somewhat. I'll also briefly mention here that it's revealed in one of the last flashback scenes before the book's final confrontation between Luke and the intelligence behind the ambrosia that Clayton suffered sexual abuse at the hands of the boys' mother. I've avoided talking about the brother's mother for this review because she's a topic that I honestly don't know how I feel about. All of her scenes do make me pretty uncomfortable, and normally I hate reading them because they're flashbacks, and most of the horror associated with her otherwise appears to be merely because of her weight, but whatever. Anyways, Clayton, as a scientific genius, is able to put a stop to the abuse by poisoning his mother and killing her. Clayton's abuse and subsequent revenge is framed as the origin for his detached attitude from humanity. And while the subject matter will undoubtedly be off-putting to many, I also found that this flashback scene was mostly fine to me. These penultimate pages had really begun developing the brothers' relationship, so while Luke was still a kind of blank NPC to me, he was at least a blank NPC with a brother that he had a defined relationship with. And this flashback did a lot of work to recontextualize and add depth to their final scene together. And while I wrote earlier that Clayton is a kind of Big Bang Theory style cliche, well, sure, it's a kind of justification for him being like that as well. So yeah, I enjoyed this last little portion a decent bit, and it helped to save the book from the utter hell of my memory. I'm glad I reread it for this reason. Now I'm approaching the ending of the book, and I will spoil the ending in broad strokes, but as you can tell, I've been trying to be careful not to fully spoil the book, because if you do want to read it, I think you should. So I'm going to very deliberately give one or two things away, but I've left a lot to discover on your own. However, before I get to the ending, there's one more thing that I want to comment on that I haven't been able to organically mention yet, and it's very difficult for me to articulate. Very often, in nearly any situation, if there is a noise, Nick Cutter will write, no matter what, the onomatopoeia for that sound. First of all, screw this book for making me try to spell that word, onomatopoeia. What a nightmare. Go ahead, try spelling it without looking up how to. Now, you might think I'm kidding, but here are some examples just from a minute or two of scrolling, and please just know that this is absolute torture for me to read these out loud.
Thwillpipit, floop, whoosh whoosh, schlips, shriek, ha-thump, tuck, 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 tuck.
Yes, I'm being a little bit unfair. Yes, I'm taking these out of context, but I promise you, there was never a scenario in which I read one of these, and there were many that I left out. I assure you, dear viewer, I left you plenty to go and find on your own, but there was never a time where I read one and was thankful it was there. It only ever served to take me out of the book. To try and be generous, these are mostly harmlessly goofy in scenes that aren't tense. Like, yes, they still disrupt the reading flow, but Nick Cutter was already doing that with the flashback scenes, so why not add in something funny to do the same thing? However, when these onomatopoeia, if that's the plural version of the word, were present during a tense scene, like where a monster, or of course the hallucination of a monster, was prowling around, this evaporated the tension. There is nothing worse than reading the word ha-thump when you're supposed to be feeling a growing dread. The problem is that Nick Cutter could have just described the sound and been better off. And I know he can. Whenever he did, he proved himself to be more than adept at doing so. In fact, when the right context arose, Nick Cutter showed himself to be genuinely skilled at creating suspense and dread, and part of this is the verbal description of sound. He would evoke the sound, but the crucial part is that whatever we hear in our heads is much better and more effective than whatever he would literally translate onto the page. By putting the onomatopoeia into the scenes, especially the tense ones, Nick Cutter erased the tense images and noises we created with our minds that were actually scary. Show me descriptively what the sound is. Make me hear it. Don't tell me what the sound is by spelling it out. Okay, we've reached the ending. After going through some more silly hallucinations, Luke confronts two entities who constitute the intelligence behind the ambrosia. They admit that they've orchestrated nearly all of the events of the book, partially because they love playing games and are endlessly, ceaselessly, pathologically curious, which again plays into the theme of exploitation and power and experimentation. But the ultimate reason that they used the ambrosia is that they needed to lure Clayton and then Luke down to the Trieste, because they desire freedom since they've been trapped in the Mariana Trench for some reason. I enjoy this scene now, which is surprising because I had a searing, blinding hatred for this the first time I read it. I at first thought these two entities were goofy chumps. I couldn't help but see them as two of the Spider-Man villains from the Me and the Boys meme, and I still think they kind of are for a reason I'll discuss in a little bit, but letting go of my trembling rage and allowing that they actually tied in very well to the main theme of the book made me like them more. I do have a problem with this ending though, and this has tortured me for years. It has to do with the gets. Remember the gets at the beginning of the video? I stressed how much I enjoyed the premise, especially how it related to the gets as the driving force of the plot, and how the gets is framed as a problem to be solved, how it's framed as mysterious, all that. It's all over the marketing of the book, it's the centerpiece of the first few pages, and is the title of the first section of the novel. And the book hinted that there were mysterious connections between the ambrosia and the gets, through the bees. The bees are the only species other than humanity that gets the gets, and they seem to be the only animal species with a strange interest in the ambrosia. Now, this can also be a commentary not so much on the connection between the gets and the ambrosia, since there is none, as we'll see, but more that the bees have a symbolic connection with humanity, as Nick Cutter sees it. So of course they will also have an interest in the ambrosia. But that begs the question, why not something like chimpanzees and bonobos? Those animals aren't ever mentioned once and are very similar to humans. And other than their mathematical hives, the bees' connection to humanity is weak at best, but whatever. And it's even kind of speculated by the scientists that the devil placed the plague as an explicit puzzle to be solved by the ambrosia, a perfect lock that could only be opened by the perfect key that is the ambrosia. I also mentioned that one of the other main themes of this book is memory. Now, I don't think it was done particularly well because of the flashbacks, but the Gets is obviously important for this, as it is the kind of inversion of the flashback intensities that Luke undergoes while in the Trieste. Basically, all this is to say that the Gets is really, really important, at least in the first half. After a while though, the book basically forgets about it. Seriously, it's actually pretty funny that memory is a huge theme of the book, but the Deep suddenly gets amnesia about its own amnesia plague. That's fine, ultimately, because it was becoming clear that the book was not exactly going to have a happy ending where the Gets would be solved. Okay, cool, whatever. But maybe some answers, or at least some thematic resolution. That's what I was hoping for from the final conversation with the entities. And Luke asks them about the Gets, since the entities are actually quite talkative and happy to explain literally everything else. And what do they say? Not our doing. Just a happy little coinky-dink, that old amnesia plague that's such an integral part of this novel that just gets dismissed halfway through. We didn't cause the Gets at all. It just happened to pass by, and we took advantage of it. We couldn't have caused it if we wanted to. In fact, we think you humans would have come for the ambrosia without it. That's right, a cure to any disease, even without the Gets, would have been a sufficient lure to bring them down to the Mariana Trench. The translation of this is that the Gets was a pointless inclusion in the book. I cannot tell you how frustrating this was to read. I was just begging at this point for any kind of resolution for the Gets plotline, and to not only have it go unresolved, but flagrantly dismissed like this was just painful. On my first read through of the book, I think this was part of the reason I truly hated it so much. But on my second read, I tried to see a little bit more where Nick Cutter was coming from. And really, I think the biggest hint is in a Dr. Westlake chapter 64% of the way through, where he speculates that the Gets was merely the vehicle to get humanity down to the site of the ambrosia. But still, this is barely a hint. In fact, this still assigns the Gets a major role in the plan of the entities. And to be clear what I mean before I outline what my problems are, let me refer back to Dead Space, the first game. That game features the red marker, which is actually more analogous to ambrosia here, but the point will still stand. The red marker is based on the black marker, which is a mysterious alien artifact that emits seemingly endless amounts of energy, but seems to create hallucinations and reanimate dead bodies and whatnot. It practically begs for an explanation, but the game never gives you one, not once, and it's never unsatisfying. Telling you that the black marker is of alien origin is basically enough. Because the story's ultimate message about the markers is that yeah, these things are interesting, mysterious, and have cool properties, but they are way too dangerous and need to be buried ASAP. The story acknowledges your curiosity, doesn't dismiss it, but says it's probably misplaced. The Deep dismisses the Gets out of hand at the end, but the book feeds the flames of your curiosity about it. It makes you think the Gets is important, and then basically gaslights you into thinking it's not. That is the issue. It's not strictly that the Deep doesn't explain the Gets. It's that the book positions the Gets as a central element of the story that it is telling, and then moves to treat it as an irrelevancy. The Road, for example, has an apocalypse that it never really expands upon at all, but it's never treated as something worth your consideration. It exists purely to set the stage, and that's it. Now, in universe, it does technically make sense. Like, on a basic level, yes, it's just the characters speculating that the Gets has this connection to the ambrosia. And if we step away from that, we can doubt the characters. That's fine. Like, there's not a plot hole or story hole here that doesn't make sense by not giving the Gets a wider meaning, or at least acknowledging it more. I think there are a couple reasons otherwise why it makes me frustrated though. For one, without really tying down the Gets, it leaves the theme of memory pretty unresolved. This is already one of the book's weaker aspects, but when the amnesia plague is one, forgotten about, and two, left unincorporated into the wider story and thematic arc of the novel, the theme of memory doesn't really go anywhere. It's just kind of like, yeah, Luke experiences memories in this book. It doesn't end up saying anything interesting at all. I honestly don't even like calling it a theme or whatever, because it doesn't feel like that. It just feels like something the book likes to play with occasionally. There's no message surrounding it at all. Some people call The Deep a kind of cosmic horror story, and I think that's an accurate-ish assessment, since the entities definitely fit some of the traits of a cosmic horror villain, and potentially leaving the Gets unresolved has some flavor of a cosmic horror message. Why should the universe care about your need for thematic resolution or answers? Sometimes diseases happen, Branamander. Why don't you quit complaining? I think this is probably the most potent explanation, but I also think it doesn't really go far enough, because at the end of the day, the entities explain everything else to Luke. I'm talking basically everything else. In fact, they are pretty unique cosmic horror villains in that they are uniquely interested in humanity rather than indifferent. If Nick Cutter had made them responsible for the Gets, they would have told Luke, basically. So it's just a deliberate and strange choice on Cutter's part to make them not responsible. Like, this is a novel where cosmic indifference isn't the norm at all. It's a book where overwhelming cosmic interest is the norm, and appealing to cosmic indifference for this one case just seems strange. Sometimes it feels like laziness on Nick Cutter's part. It feels like he wrote a book with a really cool premise, but it ended up going in a completely different direction that didn't really acknowledge the premise as much. And rather than do some serious edits and revisions to make the novel more coherent, he just decided to dismiss the premise lazily. My addled brain can only think that if it isn't just laziness on Cutter's part, he chose to do this to make the reader part of the theme of exploitation. He chose to lie to us about the Gets. He chose to make us believe it was important, to toy with our expectations and make us want an answer, and then make us feel small and angry at the end, make us feel exploited. And if that's true, then I kinda hate that. Not only is that just lame because it's Nick Cutter just framing himself as bigger and more powerful than his reader base, but it's deliberate marketing misleading too. And that's why I think that even if the lack of a thematic resolution for the Gets can be reconciled within the book somehow, which is probably possible, I don't really care that much. If you want to mount a glorious defense of this book, please go ahead. But there's two levels that I'm trying to critique this on. Within the book, looking at it thematically and whatnot, and as a reader, kind of more as a review. And I just can't let go of my feelings of being disrespected as a reader. Like, at the end of the day, I spent money on this book, and the Gets was all over the marketing and was integral to the premise that I enjoyed, and I just felt like my excitement was dismissed, and that just isn't a good feeling. So yeah, not a super deep critique, ultimately. There were reasons above that I don't think it's great at a deeper level to dismiss the Gets as unimportant, but at the end of the day, it just disappointed me because I bought the book because I thought it sounded cool for that purpose, and it didn't live up to it at all. And I know that Nick Cutter likely didn't have much control over the marketing, but the fact still stands that he wrote the Gets so much into the beginning of the book. The book internally markets the Gets, and that's the problem. Like, I wish it was saved for something else, maybe another book. Because it's true, Ambrosia could have been the lure for anything, and The Gets is a terrifying enough premise on its own, and now it's been wasted in a novel that never saw it fully developed. Also, just as a side note, I said earlier that the entities are still chumps, and because I'm salty now, the reason that I think they're still goofy is because they, and their monster associates, talk to Luke throughout the book, and their dialogue is so cringeworthy. Read and find out at your own risk, but it's bad. Actually, here, listen to this quote, selected from my absolute least favorite section in the entire novel, the part with the freaking tickle trunk. And just know that I hate reading shit like this out loud. Who? Little ol' me? The crate seemed to say in a cutesy-poo voice. Menacing? No. I'm just a crate, Lukey Lou. I'm a tool that stores other tools. Switching to a Popeye growl. I am what I ams, and that's all that I ams. I don't know how to do a Popeye growl, and I refuse to even try if I knew. In this case, it's kind of unclear specifically if it's the entities directly talking to Luke or not, but this is how they speak in other cases, so it's fine. And regardless, this kind of dialogue is all over the place. Just knowing that these entities, these cosmic horror villains, are the goofballs behind this ridiculous dialogue, and others like it, makes them very hard to fear and take seriously. And yeah, speaking of a voice mismatch, The Deep feels like it was written by Stephen King, or someone from that era. It has a boomer vibe. Everyone uses the word doc instead of doctor. They're always reminiscing about early sexual escapades behind sheds and under bleachers or whatever, catching frogs, going to the barber shop, etc. The Deep just feels like it was written in a different age. Or really, rather it feels nostalgic for it. Now, the setting of The Deep is a little bit hard to assess because it's full of anachronistic language and technology. I tried to do some research, but I'm not exactly sure when it takes place. And it's honestly possible that I missed a sentence that revealed the exact year. Regardless, the book's old school vibe definitely doesn't mesh with the rest of the book, at least for me. It feels very out of place, and I didn't particularly enjoy it. It felt imitative. Otherwise though, I have to say that Nick Cutter is obviously an impressive prose stylist. The book overall has an oppressive atmosphere that does build dread in the places that it needs to, for sure. I think that saved the book for me, and I can honestly say that if Nick Cutter was able to rein in his worst tendencies, I think I'd be very likely to enjoy a different novel. People enjoy The Troop a lot, and I think I'll read it at some point, because the good parts of The Deep are quite good, but the bad parts really turned me off. So yeah, that's my critique of the book. It's got some good ideas, a fantastic premise, a few standout moments, but destroys its own pacing, disrespects its own premise, and fails to understand a few basic aspects of horror storytelling. Rereading the book diminished my hatred a lot, but I'm still not a fan of the book at all. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, I have an entire playlist of videos on horror fiction that you might enjoy. Please share your thoughts on the book and maybe some of Nick Cutter's other books. Also, any good sci-fi horror recommendations are, of course, greatly appreciated. Please subscribe and like if you feel so inclined. It really helps me out if you enjoyed the video. Otherwise, have a nice day.